The most iconic shipwreck in history, the Titanic.
Relics from the most famous maritime disaster in history.
Experts have used special technology to map the entire ship on the ocean floor.
But there's one version of Titanic we have never seen until this morning.
Deep beneath the Atlantic Ocean, a new look at the legendary Titanic.
We have some stunning new images tonight from the wreck of the Titanic.
These fresh images exposing an altered landscape 2.5 miles underwater. The ship's most recognizable feature, the iconic bow, showing signs of inevitable decay.
Deep beneath the cold, dark waters of the Atlantic lies the wreckage of the Titanic, where a camera lost for over a century has recently been uncovered. Remarkably, the film inside survived the test of time. When developed, it reveals not just faded memories, but a haunting glimpse into the Titanic's final hours. In this video, we'll journey from the ship's grand beginnings to the fateful night of the disaster, unveiling astonishing artifacts along the way. Join us as we explore the incredible discovery of these photos and the secrets they hold about the night the unsinkable ship met its tragic fate. The ship's history. The Titanic, long considered unsinkable, was so much more than a ship. It was a symbol of human achievement, luxury, and pride. Designed to be the biggest and most advanced of its day, it was a symbol for all that mankind hoped and dreamed in the early 1900s. Today, when we hear the name Titanic, we do not think of its glory or triumph, but of the tragedy that befell it. Let's turn the clock back to a time when people were dreaming big. At the beginning of the 1900s, people around the world got worked up about a new type of ocean liner. Big, fast, luxurious ships. These ships would change how people traveled across the seas forever. Already, in the middle of all of this excitement, was the Titanic. In 1907, a famous British shipping company, White Star Line, decided to construct 3 majestic liners, which became famous as Olympic class. The 3 ships were the RMS Olympic, RMS Titanic, and RMS Britannic. The second of these great ships was the Titanic, and it immediately became a star. The Olympic class liners were designed to be the finest liners ever built to either your comfort or your safety. These ships had everything you could want except for floating around in a palace. This is where it gets interesting because the Titanic was different. It wasn't just another big boat, it was massive. It was almost the length of 3 football fields at more than 882 feet. It carried more passengers and was even more comfortable than any other ship at the time. From the onset, the idea of the Titanic captivated all. The construction of it was big news all over the world. The progress of the ship was followed by people who were amazed by its immense dimensions and the grandeur of its design. It was being built in the shipyards of Belfast, Ireland. Hundreds of workers toiled day and night there to make this vision a reality. They worked incessantly through the years, putting together the ship that was supposed to be the height of modern engineering. Big it was, and they thought that building the Titanic would be safe. So it had watertight compartments and more lifeboats than any other ship in the world, and that meant it would never sink as such. The ship was stunning inside. The interior had grand staircases, luxurious dining rooms, and elegant cabins. It wasn't simply about traveling across the ocean, it was about living well while you crossed the ocean. It was seen as a symbol, a step forward, a new era of travel and comfort. On May 31st, 1911, after years of work, the Titanic was launched into the water. For the people who had worked on the ship and for the world watching, it was a moment of pride. The massive vessel was released from the dock and people stood in awe as it slowly made its way into the sea. It was a happy moment. It closed down years of hard labor and opened up what was to be a historic chapter in sea travel. But the story didn't end with the ship touching the water. Before it could set sail on its first journey, the Titanic had to go through sea trials. These tests were important to see how the ship performed and to make sure everything worked as it should. The trials went well, the ship passed all the tests, and it was declared ready to take on the world. With everything in place, excitement was built for the Titanic's maiden voyage. The ship was ready to welcome passengers from around the globe who wanted to experience its unmatched luxury. The world waited with anticipation, eager to see this new symbol of human achievement in action. The Titanic at that moment represented everything people wanted to believe about the future, an unsinkable ship full of promise and hope. Little did they know, a disaster would turn this symbol of greatness into one of history's most famous tragedies. The maiden voyage. The Titanic left Southampton, England on April 10, 1912 on its legendary first trip. It wasn't just any journey, it was the ship that people couldn't stop talking about, an enormous floating castle ready to take passengers across the Atlantic to New York City. The super rich, who found everything they could ever need in first class, the commoners who were just looking for a chance in America. The crowd buzzed with excitement as the Titanic pulled away from the dock. The mood was festive. Thrilled to be a part of something historic, passengers waved goodbye to friends and family. What's more, the ship's grand staircases, elegant lounges, and fine dining rooms were all the talk of the town. They all knew they were part of something special from the second they stepped on board. When the Titanic slipped into the Atlantic, it was clear that the ship was doing what it was supposed to do. They ate gourmet food, heard music, and wondered at the comfort and the technology that surrounded them. Yet, beneath this festive atmosphere lay subtle, ominous signs, whispers of what lay ahead. For beneath its grandeur, the Titanic was not just a marvel of luxury, it was a ship unknowingly set on a collision course with disaster. In the early days of the voyage, passengers were having the time of their lives. The weather was good and the sea was calm. The ship's crew was confident, knowing they were sailing on what was considered the safest and most advanced ship ever built. But even with all the celebration and smooth sailing, a sense of foreboding lingered just beneath the surface. There were strange incidents, small but ominous. Before the ship had even left, it narrowly avoided a collision with another vessel as it departed from the dock. Then, there was the coal fire, a smoldering blaze discovered in one of the ship's bunkers before the journey even began. These things were concerning, but no one made too much of them. The ship was unsinkable after all, or so they believed. The Titanic continued its journey, and the passengers remained blissfully unaware of the dangers ahead. They were caught up in the luxury of it all, enjoying lavish meals, sipping fine drinks, and relishing the idea of traveling on such a magnificent ship. But as the days went by, the reality of what was to come slowly began to creep in. The iceberg warnings, for one. Multiple messages had come in, warning the crew of ice ahead. These warnings were acknowledged but not acted on with the urgency they deserved.
Another ice warning. This one's from the Northern.
Thank you, Sparks. Oh, not to worry. Quite normal for this time of year. In fact, we're speeding up. I've just ordered the last boilers.
The ship maintained its speed, charging ahead as if nothing could go wrong. But why? Why was caution thrown to the wind? Was it arrogance, believing that the ship's size and strength made it immune to danger? Or was it pressure from above, the desire to make headlines by arriving in New York ahead of schedule? Whatever the reason, these warnings were brushed aside, and the Titanic sailed full steam into the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, unaware that it was heading straight for disaster. The near miss at the start, the fire, the ignored iceberg warnings. Looking back, it's easy to see these were red flags, but at the time, no one could have imagined the horror that was about to unfold. The Titanic, despite all its luxury and advanced engineering, was about to meet its match, not from human error alone, but from the forces of nature. The world would soon learn that even the grandest ship could be brought down, and the belief in its invincibility would only make the tragedy that much more heartbreaking. As the Titanic sailed on, the thrill of its maiden voyage would soon be overshadowed by the terrible reality of what was to come. The SS New York incident. Just days before the Titanic's maiden voyage, things were already off to a rocky start. The ship, docked in Southampton, England, was gearing up for its highly anticipated trip to New York. Everything was supposed to go smoothly, but right from the get-go, there were signs that maybe this journey wasn't going to be as perfect as everyone thought. One of the first signs of trouble came on the day the Titanic was set to sail. Another ship, the SS New York, was also docked in Southampton. As the Titanic began to leave, the SS New York suddenly broke free from its moorings and started drifting towards the massive liner. It seemed like the two ships were about to collide, and panic spread among the dock workers and crew members. Tugboats were called in, racing against time, and just in the nick of time, they managed to pull the SS New York away, preventing what could have been a disastrous collision. Even though disaster was avoided, this near miss left some wondering if it was a bad omen, a warning that maybe the Titanic shouldn't be leaving port after all. But that wasn't the only issue. There was another far more dangerous problem lurking on board, a coal fire.
The Titanic was headed from England to New York. A new documentary says a large coal fire in the ship's hull may have played a role in the disaster.
Discovered before the ship even left, the fire had been smoldering in one of the coal bunkers. Now, coal fires weren't unheard of on ships back then, but they were still risky, especially when they could weaken the structure of the ship. The crew worked hard to get the fire under control, but the fact that there was a fire on board as they were about to embark on their journey was unsettling. It was like a warning sign being ignored. The coal fire was never really talked about much at the time, but it was a serious issue. The fire could have weakened the ship's steel, making it more vulnerable to damage, and some believed it played a role in the disaster that followed. When the Titanic eventually hit the iceberg, it's thought that the ship was already weakened by the fire, making the impact much worse than it might have been. But these weren't the only warning signs. During the construction of the Titanic at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, several accidents took place. Workers were injured, and some even lost their lives building this unsinkable ship. These deaths weighed heavily on those who believed in signs and omens. Some whispered that the ship was cursed, that something was off about its design or construction. While accidents were common in large-scale projects like this, the sheer number of injuries and fatalities surrounding the Titanic added to the growing unease. Despite all this, the ship set off on its maiden voyage, and there was a mix of excitement and dread among the crew and passengers. People were thrilled to be part of history, eager to experience the luxury that the Titanic had promised. Yet, behind the scenes whispers about the coal fire, the near miss with the SS New York, and the accidents during construction left a shadow hanging over the trip. Looking back, it's hard to ignore all the warning signs. Each incident on its own might have seemed small or unimportant, but together, they painted a picture of a ship that wasn't as perfect as everyone had hoped. The near collision with the SS New York made people question how prepared the crew was to handle emergencies. The coal fire raised concerns about the ship's design and whether it was truly ready to make the long journey across the Atlantic. The construction accidents added to the feeling that something was wrong from the very beginning. So, why did the Titanic's leaders push forward, knowing these issues? Was it overconfidence? Did they feel the ship was too big and too well built for anything to go wrong? Or was there pressure to make headlines to arrive in New York ahead of schedule no matter the risks? We may never know for sure, but what is clear is that these problems weren't just minor bumps in the road. They were part of the bigger story that led to the Titanic's downfall. And now, as we focus on these troubling signs, we come to the moment that truly sealed the Titanic's fate, the collision with the iceberg. It's the part of the story everyone knows, but with all these warnings and near misses, it's hard not to wonder, could it have all been prevented? The iceberg. The idea that the Titanic could collide with an iceberg had been hanging in the air for a while, but by April 14th, 1912, it became more than just a remote possibility. It was bound to happen. In the days leading up to that fateful night, the Titanic's crew had received several warnings about ice in the North Atlantic. Ships already in the area, like the SS Californian, the Baltic, and the Mesaba, sent messages alerting the Titanic to the icebergs and fields of ice ahead. But these warnings were not handled the way they should have been.
He calls that an iceberg?
More like an ice cube, sir.
Some didn't even make it to the captain or senior officers. Instead, they were pushed aside, filed away, or simply overlooked. At the time, the Titanic's wireless operators were busy, very busy. The ship had a lot of well-to-do passengers who wanted to send personal messages back home. With so many telegrams going out, the warnings about ice were treated like just another routine note. The crew didn't see them as urgent, so the ship continued its journey at nearly full speed, around 22 knots. For a vessel as large as the Titanic, this was fast, especially considering the ice warnings they had been receiving. But the crew pressed on. Some say there was pressure to get to New York ahead of schedule, as if the ship could somehow make headlines with its early arrival. Others think that the ship's reputation as unsinkable gave everyone a false sense of security, making them feel like they could handle whatever came their way. Either way, the warnings were largely ignored, and the Titanic moved deeper into the North Atlantic, closer to danger. On the night of April 14th, two lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, stood in the crow's nest, scanning the dark waters for any sign of trouble. The air was cold, and they knew ice could be near. But they were at a disadvantage. No binoculars, just their eyes, trying to make out shapes in the night. Just before midnight, the temperature dropped noticeably. This was a clear sign that the ship was entering icy waters. Some of the passengers, still awake, began to feel the chill, but most had no idea what was coming. Up in the crow's nest, Fleet and Lee felt the cold too, but they stayed alert, knowing that danger could be lurking in the darkness. At 11:40 p.m., Fleet spotted something ahead. At first it was just a dark shape, but soon it became clear. It was an iceberg, and it was massive. Fleet rang the bell 3 times and called the bridge, letting them know what he saw. The officers reacted immediately. First Officer William Murdoch ordered the ship to turn hard to port and called for the engines to be reversed. But the iceberg was too close. The Titanic didn't hit it head-on, which might have been less disastrous. Instead, the iceberg scraped along the starboard side of the ship, leaving a series of small cuts below the waterline. The impact wasn't dramatic. Many passengers barely noticed anything. Some felt a slight shudder or bump, while others felt nothing at all. But down below, in the lower parts of the ship, like the mailroom and the boiler rooms, it was clear something was very wrong. Water was rushing in at an alarming rate, and it didn't take long for the crew to realize the severity of the situation. The Titanic was in serious trouble. The ship had been designed to stay afloat even if 4 of its compartments were flooded.
Here's the position. Water in the forepeak, numbers 1 and 2 holds, the mailroom, boiler room 6 and 5.
But the iceberg had damaged at least 5. The Titanic couldn't survive that. Water was flooding the compartments, and the ship's bow was already beginning to dip into the ocean. Captain Edward Smith and his officers quickly understood that the ship was sinking, and there weren't enough lifeboats for everyone on board. There had been a lot of confidence in the Titanic's design, but no one had planned for a disaster of this scale. As the crew began to send out distress signals, hoping for help from nearby ships, the reality of the situation began to sink in. There weren't enough lifeboats to save everyone, and the lifeboats they did have weren't even being filled to capacity. In some cases, lifeboats were launched only half full. Many passengers hesitated to leave the Titanic, still believing that the giant ship was safer than the small, fragile lifeboats bobbing in the freezing water. But as the bow sank lower and lower, it became clear that staying on the Titanic was no longer an option. The crew worked to keep things orderly, loading women and children into the lifeboats first. But panic began to spread. Some passengers were still in denial, holding on to the belief that the Titanic couldn't really be sinking. Others, seeing the lifeboats filling up and leaving, knew that the situation was dire. By the time the Titanic broke apart at 2:20 a.m., there was no denying the truth: the unsinkable ship had sunk. What followed was chaos. The once grand Titanic was now at the bottom of the Atlantic, 2 miles below the surface. The water was freezing, and hundreds of people were left struggling in the icy ocean. Some survived, but many did not. In the end, the iceberg, just a regular chunk of ice floating in the North Atlantic, became infamous. It wasn't special in any way, but it played a key role in one of the most tragic events in history: the camera. For over 70 years, the Titanic sat lost at the bottom of the Atlantic, far beyond anyone's reach or sight. But in 1985, everything changed. Robert Ballard, an oceanographer from America, teamed up with a French crew to find the wreck of the Titanic. They weren't just searching for the whole ship though. Instead, they were looking for pieces of it, debris scattered across the ocean floor when the ship went down. They had a new tool to help them out: a robot called Argo. Equipped with cameras and sonar, it was designed to scan the seabed. For weeks, they searched, tirelessly scanning, hoping for a sign. Then, on September 1st, 1985, they hit the jackpot. Argo's cameras picked up something big, a large boiler from the Titanic. That was it. They had found the Titanic after all these years. Excited by their discovery, Ballard and his team pushed forward. They sent robots down to explore the wreck further, taking thousands of pictures and videos. The images they captured were astonishing. They saw pieces of the Titanic scattered all over the ocean floor.
New exclusive photographs, by far the best yet, are in from the Titanic. For most of this century, that huge passenger liner has been a dead ship.
Everything from deck chairs to dishes. And then, finally, they found the bow of the ship. It was still standing tall, mostly intact, even after all those decades underwater. But as exciting as finding the Titanic was, it was only the beginning. With the help of the underwater robots, Ballard's team started to map out the entire wreck site. They soon realized that the ship hadn't sunk in one piece. It had actually split in 2. The bow was in relatively good shape, but the stern, where the engines were, was a complete mess, heavily damaged when the ship broke apart. These findings gave the world new insights into what happened on that tragic night and how the ship had really gone down. The discovery of the Titanic caused a huge stir around the world. People were fascinated by the first ever images of the wreck. Seeing the once grand ship now resting silently on the ocean floor sparked the imagination of many, but it also sparked debates. Some people thought the wreck should be left alone, untouched as a memorial to those who lost their lives. Others saw it as an opportunity to learn more about the past and make sure the mistakes made back then weren't repeated. The debate raged on and still does to this day, but the story doesn't stop there. Years after the wreck was found, divers continued to explore the Titanic, hoping to uncover more secrets. One day, they found something truly remarkable, an old vintage camera buried in the debris. The camera was in bad shape, rusted and broken after so long underwater, but surprisingly, the film inside had been preserved. When the film was developed, it revealed photos taken during the Titanic's voyage. Most of the pictures were what you'd expect, passengers enjoying the trip, shots of the ship itself. But there was one photo that stood out. It showed what looked like a huge iceberg floating in the dark waters of the North Atlantic. The image wasn't perfect. It was blurry and had clearly aged over the years, but you could still make out the jagged top of the iceberg and a deep scar running across its base. Some experts believe this could be the very iceberg that the Titanic struck that night. It's impossible to know for sure, but it's thought-provoking. The photo might just be a frozen moment in time, a glimpse of the force that brought down the mighty Titanic, a ship once thought to be unsinkable. Dreadful artifacts. Recent discoveries of artifacts from the Titanic offer a poignant glimpse into the lives of those aboard during that tragic night. One of the standout items is the Stradivarius violin that belonged to bandmaster Wallace Hartley. It was found still strapped to him after he bravely played music to soothe passengers as the ship sank. This instrument has come to symbolize not just the disaster, but also the courage displayed in the face of impending doom. Another fascinating find is a set of Edwardian perfume vials that belonged to Adolphus Saalfeld, a first-class passenger who survived the sinking. Surprisingly, these vials still contained scents even after decades submerged, leading to the creation of a modern fragrance named Legacy 1912, which aims to capture the essence of that era. Among the other notable artifacts is a bronze deck bell, which rang out as the Titanic approached the iceberg, a haunting reminder of that critical moment. A letter written just a day before the tragedy by passenger Oscar Halverson also emerged, detailing the ship's luxurious lifestyle and the aspirations of those aboard. These artifacts do more than showcase the Titanic's grandeur, they reveal the personal stories and dreams that were lost in the disaster. Reflecting on these items, one can't help but feel a deep connection to the human experiences that unfolded that night, highlighting not just the tragedy, but also the resilience of those who were affected.